Chapter 20. It was dusk when Puri Wariwe walked into the Shabono. I had not seen him since my illness, since the night he had stood in the middle of the clearing, arms outstretched as if pleading with the darkness. From Milagros I learned that for 6 consecutive days and nights, the old Shapori had taken a pina. The old man had been on the verge of collapsing under the weight of the spirits he had called into his chest. Yet, perseveringly, he had beseeched the Hikuras to cure me from the onslaught of a tropical fever. Ratimi had also emphasized that it had been a particularly hard struggle to cure me, in that the Hikura's recent being called in the rainy season. It was the Hikura of the hummingbird that saved you, she had explained. In spite of its small size, the hummingbird is a powerful spirit. It's used by an accomplished Shapori as a last resort. I had not been comforted in the least when Ratimi had wrapped her arms around my neck, assuring me that if I had died, my soul would not have wandered aimlessly in the forest, but would have ascended peacefully to the house of thunder, for my body would have been burned, and my pulverized bones would have been eaten by her and her relatives. I joined Puri Wariwe in the clearing. "I'm well now," I said, squatting beside him. He looked at me with veiled, almost dreamy eyes, then ran his hand over my head. It was a small dark hand that moved rapidly, yet felt heavy and slow. A vague tenderness softened his features, but he did not say a word. I wondered if he knew that I had felt the beak of a hummingbird cutting into my chest during my illness. I had told no one. A group of men, their faces and bodies painted black, gathered around Puri Wariwe. They blew a pina into each other's noses and listened to his chant, pleading with the Hikuras to come out of their hiding places in the mountains. The men's black figures were more like shadows, barely illuminated by the fires of the huts. Softly, they repeated the shaman's songs. I felt a chill run up my spine as I quickened the pace of their unintelligible words. I felt a chill run up my spine as the quickened pace of their unintelligible words became more menacing and forceful. Upon returning to the hut, I asked Ratimi what the men were celebrating. "They are sending the Hikuras to the Mokototeri settlement to kill the enemy." "Will the enemy really die?" Drawing up her knees, she looked pensively, beyond the palm fringe of the hut, into the pitch-dark sky, bereft of moon and stars. "They will die," she said softly. Convinced there was not going to be a real raid, I dozed in my hammock, listening to the chanting outside. More than hearing the men, I visualized the fragments of sound endlessly rising and falling, as being carried away by the smoke from the hearths. Hours later, I got up and sat outside the hut. Most of the men had retired to their hammocks. Only 10 remained in the clearing, Ituwe among them. With closed eyes, they repeated Puri Wariwe's song. His words came to me clearly through the humid air. "Follow me, follow my vision. Follow me over the treetops. Look at the birds and butterflies. Such colors you will never see on the ground. I'm rising into heaven, toward the sun." The Shapori's song was uninterrupted abruptly by one of the men. "I've been struck by the sun. My eyes are burning," he shouted as he stood up. He looked helplessly around in the darkness. His legs gave way under him, and he collapsed with a thud on the ground. No one took any notice. Puriwawire's voice became more insistent, as if he were trying to raise the men collectively toward his vision. He repeated his song again and again to those still squatting around him, urging the men not to get sidetracked in the dew of their visions. He warned them of spear-like bamboo leaves and poisonous snakes lurching from behind trees and roots on the path to the sun. Above all, he urged the men not to pass into human sleep, but to step from the darkness of the night to the white darkness of the sun. He promised them that their bodies would be soaked with the glow of the Hekuras, that their eyes would shine with the sun's precious light. I remained outside the hut until the dawn erased the shadows on the ground. Expecting to find some visible evidence of their journey to the sun, I walked from man to man, peering intently into each face. Puriwariwe watched me curiously, a mocking grin on his haggard face. "You'll find no outward indication of their flight," he said as if he had read my thoughts. "Their eyes are dull and red from the night's vigil," he added, pointing to the men who were staring indifferently into the distance, totally unconcerned with my presence. "That precious light you expect to see reflected in their pupils only shines inside them. Only they can see it." Before I had a chance to ask him about his journey to the sun, he had walked out of the Shabono into the forest. In the days that followed, a gloomy, oppressive mood enveloped the settlement. At first, it was only a vague feeling, but I finally became obsessed with the certainty I was being purposely kept in the dark about some impending event. I became morose, distant, and irritable. I struggled against my sensations of isolation. I tried to hide my ill-focused apprehension, yet I felt as if I were being attacked by unidentifiable forces. Whenever I asked Ritimi or any of the other women if there was some approaching change, they would not even acknowledge my question. Instead, they would comment on some silly incident, hoping to make me laugh. "Are we going to be raided?" I finally asked Arasue one day. He turned his perplexed face toward me, as if he were trying to untangle my words. I felt confused, nervous, and close to tears. I told him that I was not stupid, that I had noticed how the men were constantly on the alert, and how the women were afraid to go by themselves into the gardens, or to fish in the river. "Why can't someone tell me what is going on?" I yelled. "There is nothing going on," Arasue said calmly, folding his arms behind his neck. He stretched comfortably in his hammock. He began to talk about something unrelated to my question, chuckling frequently at his own tale. But I was not to be soothed. I did not laugh with him. I did not even pay attention to his words. He seemed totally bewildered as I stomped back to my hut. I was miserable for days, feeling alternately resentful and sorry for myself. I did not sleep well. I kept repeating to myself that I, who had so totally embraced this new life, was suddenly treated like a stranger. I felt angry and betrayed. I could not accept that Arasue had not taken me into his confidence. Not even Ritime had been willing to put me at ease. If only Milagros were here, I wished fervently. Surely he would dispel my anxiety. He would tell me everything. One night, when I could not quite lose myself in sleep, but hovered in a half-waking state, I was suddenly hit by an insight. It did not come in words, but translated itself as a whole process of thoughts and memories that flashed like pictures before me and put everything into a proper perspective. I felt elated. I began to laugh with relief that turned into sheer joy. I could hear my laughter echo through the huts. Sitting up in my hammock, I noticed that most of the Itikoteri were laughing with me. Arasue squatted by my hammock. "Have the spirits of the forest made you mad?" he inquired, holding my head between his hands. "Quite mad," I said, still laughing. I looked into his eyes. They shone in the darkness. I gazed at Ritimi, Tutemi, and Itua standing next to Arasue, their curious, sleepy faces aglow with laughter. Words blurted out of me in an unending procession, piling onto one another with astonishing velocity. I was speaking in Spanish, not because I wanted to conceal anything, but because my explanation would not have made sense in their language. Arasue and the others listened as if they understood, as if they sensed my need to unburden myself of the turmoil within me. I realized that I was, after all, an outsider, and my demand to be informed of events not even the Itikoteri talked about among themselves was due to my feelings of self-importance. What had turned me into an intolerable individual was the thought of being left out, excluded from something I believed I had a right to know. I had not questioned why I believed I had the right to know. It had made me miserable, blinding me to all the joyful moments I had so much cherished before. The gloom and oppressiveness I had felt was not outside, but within me, communicating itself to the Shabono and its people. I felt Arasue's calloused hand on my shaven tonsure. I did not feel ashamed of my feelings, but was glad to realize that it was up to me to restore the sense of magic and wonder at being in a different world. "Blow a pina in my nose," Arasue said to Itua. "I want to make sure the evil spirits stay away from the white girl." I heard murmuring, a rustling of voices, a soft laughter, then Arasue's monotonous chant. I fell into a peaceful sleep, the best I had had for days. Little Tishoma, who had not come into my hammock for days, awoke me at dawn. "I heard you laugh last night," she said, snuggling against me. "You had not laughed for so many days. I was afraid you would not laugh ever again." I gazed into her bright eyes, as if I might find in them the answer that would enable me in the future to laugh away all the anxiety and turmoils of my spirit. An unusual stillness enshrouded the Shabono as the shades of night closed in around us. The lulling touch of Tutemi's fingers as she searched my head for lice almost put me to sleep. The women's noisy chatter subsided to whispers as they went about preparing the evening meals and nursing their babies. As if obeying an unspoken command, the children forsook their vociferous evening games and gathered in Arasue's hut to listen to old Kamosiwe's tales. He seemed to be totally engrossed in his own words, gesturing dramatically with his hands as he talked. Yet his own eye was fixed intently on the long tubes of sweet potatoes sticking out from the embers. I watched in awe as the old man picked the roots out of the fire with his bare hand. Not waiting for the potatoes to cool, he crammed them into his mouth. From where I sat, I could see the waning moon appear over the treetops, obscured by the traveling clouds that shone white against the dark sky. The night stillness was pierced by an eerie sound, something between a scream and a growl. The next instant, Etue, his face and body painted black, materialized out of the shadows. He stood in front of the fires that had been lit in the clearing and clacked his bow and arrows high above his head. I did not see from which hut the others appeared, but 11 more men, their faces and bodies equally blackened, joined Etue in the clearing. Etue. Arasue pushed and pulled each of them until they all stood in a perfectly straight line. Then, after positioning the last man in place, he joined them. The head man began to sing in a deep, nasal tone. The others repeated the last line of his song in a chorus. I could distinguish each separate voice in the murmured harmony, though I understood none of the words. The longer they sang, the angrier the men seemed to become. At the end of each song, they let out the most ferocious screams I had ever heard. Oddly, I had the feeling that the louder they yelled, the more remote was their rage, as if it was no longer part of their black-painted bodies. Abruptly, they became silent. The faint light of the fires accentuated the wrathful expression on their rigid, mask-like faces, the feverish glow in their eyes. I could not see if Arasue gave the command, but in unison they shouted, "How will I enjoy watching my arrow hit the enemy? How I will enjoy seeing his blood splash all over the ground." Holding their weapons above their heads, the warriors broke the line and gathered into a tight circle. They began to shout, first softly, then in such piercing voices that I felt a chill run down my spine. They were silent once more, and Retime whispered in my ear that the men were listening to the echo of their screams so they could determine from which direction it came. The echoes, she explained, carried the spirits of the enemy. Groaning, clacking their weapons, the men began to prance about the clearing. Arasue calmed them down. 2 more times they gathered into a tight circle and shouted with all their might. Instead of walking into the forest, as I had expected and feared, the men moved toward the huts standing close to the entrance of the Shabono. They lay down in the hammocks and forced themselves to vomit. "Why are they doing that?" I asked Retime. "While they chanted, they devoured their enemies," she said. "Now they have to get rid of the rotten flesh." I sighed with relief, yet I felt oddly disappointed that the raid had been acted out symbolically. Shortly before dawn, I was awakened by the wailing of women. I rubbed my eyes to make sure I was not dreaming. As if no time had elapsed, the men stood outside in exactly the same straight formation they had assumed earlier in the night. Their cries had lost their fierceness, as if the wails of the women had dampened their wrath. They flung the plantain bundles, which had been stacked at the Shabono's entrance, over their shoulders, then marched dramatically down the path leading to the river. Old Kamosiwe and I followed the men at a distance. I thought it was raining, but it was only dew dripping from leaf to leaf. For a moment the men stood still, their shadows perfectly outlined against the light sand of the river bank. The half moon had traveled across the sky, shimmering faintly through the misty air. As if the sand had sucked in their shadows, the men vanished before my eyes. All I heard was the sound of rustling leaves, of snapping branches receding into the forest. The mist closed in on us like an impenetrable wall, as though nothing had happened, as if all I had seen was only a dream. Old Kamosiwe, sitting beside me on a rock, touched my arm lightly. "I no longer hear the echoes of their steps," he said, then slowly walked into the water. I followed him. I shivered with coldness. I felt the little fish that hide beneath the submerged roots brush against my legs, but I could not see them in the dark waters. Old Kamosiwe giggled as I rubbed him dry with leaves. "Look at the sikomasik," he said rapturously, pointing to the white mushrooms growing on a rotten tree trunk. I picked them up for him, wrapping them in leaves. When roasted over the fire, they were considered a delicacy, particularly by the old people. Kamosiwe held the end of his broken bow toward me. I pulled him up the slippery path leading to the Shabono. The mist did not rise the whole day, as if the sun were afraid to witness the men's journey through the forest. Chapter 21. Little Tashoma sat next to me on the log in the bamboo grass. "Aren't you going to catch any frogs?" I asked her. She looked at me woefully. Her eyes, usually so bright, were dull. Slowly they filled with tears. "What makes you sad?" I asked, cradling her in my arms. Children were never left to cry for fear that their soul might escape through their mouths. Lifting her on my back, I headed toward the Shabono. "You are as heavy as a basket full of ripe plantains," I said in an effort to make her laugh. But the little girl did not even smile. Her face remained pressed against my neck. Her tears rolled, unchecked, down my breasts. Carefully, I laid her down in her hammock. She clung to me tenaciously, forcing me to lie beside her. Soon she was asleep. It was not a peaceful sleep. From time to time, her little body trembled as if she were in the throes of some dreadful nightmare. With Tutemi's baby strapped to her back, Ritime entered the hut. She began to cry as she looked at the sleeping child next to me. "I'm sure one of the evil Mokototeri Shapori has lured her soul away." Ritime wept with such heartbreaking sobs. I left Tashoma's hammock and sat next to her. I did not know quite what to say. I was sure Ritime was not only crying for her little daughter, but also for Atiwe, who had been gone with the raiding party for almost a week. Since her husband's departure, she had not been her usual self. She had not worked in the gardens, neither had she accompanied any of the women to gather berries or wood in the forest. Listless and dejected, She moped around the Shabono. Most of the time she lay in her hammock, playing with Tutemi's baby. No matter what I did or said to cheer her up, I was unable to erase the forlorn expression on her face. The rueful little smile with which Ritime responded to my efforts only made her look all the more despondent. I put my arms around her neck and planted loud kisses on her cheek, reassuring her all the time that Teshoma had nothing but a cold. Ritime was not to be consoled. Weeping did not bring her any release or tire her out, but only intensified her distress. Maybe something has happened to Itiwe, Ritime said. Maybe El Mokototeri has killed him. Nothing has happened to Itiwe, I stated. I can feel it in my legs. Ritime smiled slightly, as if doubting my words. But why is my little daughter sick? She insisted. Teshoma is sick because she got chilled, playing in the swamps with the frogs, I stated matter-of-factly. Children get sick very fast and recuperate just as speedily. Are you sure that's the way it is? Absolutely sure, I said. Ritime looked at me doubtfully, then said, But none of the other children are sick. I know Teshoma has been bewitched. Not knowing how to answer, I suggested that it would be best to call Ritime's uncle. Moments later, I returned with Ira Mamoe. During his brother Arasue's absence, Ira Mamoe assumed the duties of a headman. His bravery made him the most qualified man to defend the Shabono from potential raiders. His reputation as a shaman ensured the settlement of protection against evil hikuras sent by enemy sorcerers. Ira Mamoe looked at the child, then asked me to fetch his ipina cane and the container with the hallucinogenic powder. He had a young man blow the snuff into his nose, then chanted to the hikuras, pacing up and down in front of the hut. From time to time, he jumped high in the air, yelling at the evil spirits, which he believed had lodged in the child's body, to leave Teshoma alone. Gently, Ira Mamoe massaged the child, starting with her head, down her chest, her stomach, all the way to her feet. He flicked his hands repeatedly, shaking off the evil hikuras he had drawn out of Teshoma. Several other men took a pina and chanted with Ira Mamoe throughout the night. He alternately massaged and sucked the disease from her little body. However, the child was not any better the following day. Motionless, she lay in her hammock. Her eyes were red and swollen. She refused all food, including the water and honey I offered her. Ira Mamoe diagnosed that her soul had wandered from her body and proceeded to build a platform with poles and lianas in the middle of the clearing. He fastened acai palm leaves in his hair. He drew circles around his eyes and mouth with a mixture of anoto and coals. Prancing around the platform, he imitated the cries of the harpy eagle. With a branch from one of the bushes growing around the Shabono, he swept the ground thoroughly in an effort to locate the wandering soul of the child. Unable to find the soul, he gathered several of Teshoma's playmates around him. He decorated their hair and faces the same as his, then lifted them onto the platform. Examine the ground from above, he told the children. Find your sister's soul. Imitating the cries of the harpy eagle, The children jumped up and down on the precariously built structure. They swept the air with the branches the women had handed them. But they too were unable to catch the lost soul. Taking the branch Ratimi gave me, I joined the others in the quest. We swept the paths leading to the river, to the gardens, and to the swamps, where Teshoma had been catching frogs. Iramamoe exchanged his branch for mine. You carried her to the Shabono, he said. Maybe you can find her soul. Without any thoughts as to the futility of the task, I swept the ground with the same eagerness as the others. How does one know the soul is nearby? I asked Iramamoe as we retraced our steps back to the Shabono. One just knows, he said. We searched in every hut, sweeping under hammocks, around each hearth, and behind stacks of plantains. We lifted baskets from the ground. We moved bows and arrows leaning against the sloping roof. We scared spiders and scorpions out of their nests in the thatched roof. I gave up the hunt when I saw a snake slithering from behind one of the rafters. Laughing, old Hayama cut the reptile's head off with one swift blow of Iramamoe's machete. She wrapped the still wriggling, headless snake in pishansi leaves, then placed it on the fire. Hayama also collected the spiders falling on the ground. These too were wrapped in leaves and roasted. Old people were particularly fond of the soft bellies. The legs Hayama saved, to be ground later. The powder was believed to heal cuts, bites, and scratches. By dusk, little Teshoma showed no signs of improvement. Motionless, she lay in her hammock, her eyes staring vacantly at the thatched roof. I was filled with an indescribable sense of helplessness as Iramamoe once again bent over the child to massage and suck out the evil spirits. Let me try to cure the child, I said. Iramamoe smiled almost imperceptibly, focusing his gaze alternately on me and Teshoma. What makes you think you can cure my grandniece? He asked with deliberate thoughtfulness. There was no mockery in his tone, only a vague curiosity. We have not found her soul. A powerful enemy Shapori has lured it away. Do you think you can counteract an evil sorcerer's curse? No, I hastily assured him. Only you can do that. What will you do then? He asked. You said once that you never cured anyone. What makes you think you can cure now? I will help Teshoma with hot water, I said, and you will cure her with your chants to the Hikuras. Iramamoe deliberated for a moment. Gradually, his thoughtful expression relaxed. He held his hand over his mouth, as if he were hiding an urge to giggle. Did you learn much from the Shapori you knew? I remember some of the ways they cured, I answered, but did not mention that the cure I intended for Teshoma was my grandmother's way of dealing with the fever that had not broken. You said you have seen Hikuras in my eyes. If you chant to them, maybe they will help me. An easy smile came and lingered around Iramamoe's lips. He seemed almost convinced by my reasoning. Yet he shook his head, as if full of doubt. Curing is not done this way. How can I ask the Hikuras to help you? Will you also take Ipina? I won't need to take the snuff, I assured him, then remarked that if a powerful Shapori could command his hikuras to steal the soul of a child, then an accomplished sorcerer like himself could certainly command his spirits, which according to him were already acquainted with me, to come to my aid. I will call the hikuras to assist you, Iramamoe declared. I will take a pina for you. While one of the men blew the hallucinogenic substance into Iramamoe's nostrils, Ritime, Tutemi, and Arasue's wives brought me calabashes filled with hot water that old Hayama had heated in the large aluminum pots. I soaked my cut-up blanket in the hot water, and, using the legs of my jeans as gloves, I wrung each thin strip of cloth until not a drop of moisture was to be squeezed out. Carefully, I wrapped them around Toshoma's body, then covered her with the heated palm fronds some of the older boys had cut for me. I could hardly move among the crowd gathered in the hut. Silently, they watched my every motion, intent and alert, so as not to miss anything. Iramamoe squatted beside me, chanting tirelessly into the night. As the hours passed, the people retired to their hammocks. I was not put off by their show of disapproval, but kept changing the compresses as soon as they cooled off. Ritime sat silently in her hammock, her interlaced fingers resting limply on her lap in an attitude of supreme hopefulness. Whenever she glanced at me, she broke into tears. Toshoma seemed oblivious to my ministrations. What if she had said something? What if she had something other than a cold? I thought. What if she got worse? My assurance faltered. I mumbled a prayer for her with a fervor I had not had since I was a child. Looking up, I noticed Iramamoe gazing at me. He seemed anxious, as if aware of the mixture of feelings, magic, religion, and fear, fighting inside me. Determinedly, he went on chanting. Old Kamasiwe came and joined us. He squatted close to the hearth. The cold of dawn had not yet crept into the hut, but the mere fact that there was a fire made him huddle over it instinctively. Softly he began to chant. His murmured song filled me with comfort. It seemed to carry the voices of past generations. The rain prattled on the thatched roof with a determined vigor, then relaxed into a light drizzle that plunged me into a kind of stupor. It was almost dawn when Toshoma began tossing in her hammock. Impatiently, she tore at the wet pieces of blanket, at the palm fronds wrapped around her. With eyes opened, wide in surprise, she sat up, then smiled at old Kamosiwe, Iramamoe, and myself crouching beside her hammock. "I'm thirsty," she said, then gulped down the water and honey I gave her. "Will she be well?" Ritime asked hesitantly. "Iramamoe lured her soul back," I said. The hot water has broken her fever. Now she needs to be kept warm and sleep peacefully." I walked into the clearing and stretched my cramped legs. Old Kamasiwe, leaning against a pole, looked like a child with his forearms tightly wrapped around his chest to keep warm. Iramamoe stopped beside me on the way to his hut. We did not talk, but I was certain we shared a moment of absolute understanding. Chapter 22. At the sound of approaching steps, Tutami motioned me to lower myself beside the moldy leaves of the squash vines. "It's the raiding party," she whispered. "Women are not supposed to see from which direction the warriors return." Unable to curb my curiosity, I slowly stood up. There were 3 women with the men. One of them was pregnant. "Don't look," Tutami pleaded, pulling me down. "If you see the path on which the raiders return, the enemy will capture you." "How beautiful the men look with the bright feathers streaming from their armbands and the onoto designs on their bodies," I said. "But Itiwe is missing. Do you think he has been killed?" I asked in dismay. Tutami looked at me, a dazed expression on her face. There was no nervousness in her movements as she separated the large squash leaves to peek at the retreating figures. Her anxious face beamed with a smile as she grabbed my arm. "Look, there is Itiwe." She pulled my head close to hers so I could see where she was pointing. "He is Unukai." Trailing a distance behind the others, Itiwe walked slowly, with his shoulders hunched forward as if he were burdened by a heavy weight on his back. He was not adorned with feathers or paint. Only short little sticks of arrow cane were stuck through his pierced earlobes, and one arrow cane stick was tied to each wrist like a bracelet. "Is he ill?" "No, he is Unukai," she said admiringly. "He has killed a Mokoto Teri." Unable to share Tutami's excitement, I could only stare at her in dumb incredulity. I felt my eyes fill with tears and turned my gaze away from her. We waited until Itiwe was out of sight, then slowly headed toward the Shabono. Tutami quickened her pace upon hearing the welcoming shouts from the men and women in the huts. Surrounded by the exultant Itikoteri, the raiders stood proudly in the clearing. Turning away from her husband, Arasue's youngest wife approached the 3 captive women, who had not been included in the jubilant greetings. Silently, they stood apart, their apprehensive gazes fixed on the approaching Itikoteri women. "Painted with onoto. How disgusting," Arasue's wife yelled. "What else can one expect from a Mokoto Teri woman? Do you think you have been invited to a feast?" Glaring at the 3 women, she picked up a stick. "I will beat you all. If I had been captured, I would have run away," she shouted. The 3 Mokoto Teri huddled closer to each other. "At least I would have arrived crying pitifully," Arasue's wife hissed, pulling the hair of one of the women. Arasue stepped in between his wife and the Mokoto Teri. "Leave them alone. They have cried so much they have soaked the path with their tears. We made them stop. We didn't want to listen to their wails." Arasue took the stick away from his wife. "We demanded they paint their faces and bodies with onoto. These women will be happy here. They will be treated well." He turned to the rest of the Itikoteri women who had gathered around his wife. "Give them something to eat. They are hungry like us. We haven't eaten for 2 days." Arasue's wife was not intimidated. "Were your men killed?" she asked the 3 women. "Did you burn them? Have you eaten their ashes?" She faced the pregnant woman. "Was your husband also killed? Do you expect an Itikoteri man to become a father to your child?" Pushing his wife roughly away, Arasue announced, "Only one man was killed. He was shot by Itiwe's arrow. He was the man who killed Itiwe's father the last time the Mokoto Teri raided us so treacherously." Arasue turned to the pregnant woman. There was no sympathy in his eyes or in his voice as he continued. You were captured by the Mokototeri some time ago. You have no brothers among them who will rescue you. You are now an Itikoteri. Do not cry any longer. Arasue went on to explain to the three captives that they would be better off with his people. The Itikoteri, he stressed, had enjoyed meat almost every day, as well as plenty of roots and plantains throughout the rainy season. No one had gone hungry. One of the captives was only a young girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old. What will happen to her? I asked Tutemi. Like the others, she will be taken as a wife, Tutemi said. I was probably her age when I was abducted by the Itikoteri. A wistful little smile curved her lips. I was lucky Ritime's mother-in-law chose me as a second wife for Itiwe. He has never beaten me. Ritime treats me like a sister. She does not quarrel with me, nor does she make me work too. Tutemi broke in mid-sentence as Arasue's youngest wife resumed her shouting at the Mokototeri women. How disgusting to come all painted. All you need is to stick flowers in your ears and start to dance. She followed the three women into her husband's hut. Did the men rape you in the forest? Is that why you stayed away so long? You must have enjoyed it. Pushing the pregnant woman, she added, Did they also sleep with you? Shut up, Arasue yelled, or I'll beat you till I draw blood. Arasue turned to the woman who had followed behind. You should rejoice that your men have returned unharmed. You should be content that Etue has killed a man, that we have brought 3 captives. Go to your huts and prepare food for your men. Grumbling, the women dispersed to their respective hearths. Why is only Arasue's wife so upset? I asked Tutemi. Don't you know? She asked, smiling maliciously. She is afraid he will take one of the women as his 4th wife. Why does he want so many? He is powerful, Tutemi stated categorically. He has many son-in-law who bring plenty of game and help him work in the gardens. Arasue can feed many women. Were the captives raped? I asked. One was. Tutemi was momentarily puzzled by my shocked expression, then went on to explain that a captured woman was usually raped by all the men in the raiding party. It's the custom. Did they also rape the young girl? No, Tutemi said casually. She is not yet a woman. Neither did they rape the pregnant one. They are never touched. Ritimi had remained in her hammock throughout the whole commotion. She told me she had no reason to get worked up about the Mokototeri women, for she knew Etue would not take a 3rd wife. I was happy to notice that her sadness and dejection, which had been so much a part of her during the last few days, had vanished. Where is Etue? I asked. Is he not coming to the Shabono? Ritime's eyes appeared almost feverish with excitement as she explained that her husband, since he had killed an enemy, was searching for a tree not too far from the settlement on which he could hang his old hammock and quiver. However, before he could do so, he had to strip the tree's trunk and branches of its bark. Ritime's eyes expressed a deep concern as she faced me. She warned me against gazing at such a tree. She was certain I would not confuse it with the kind that is stripped of its bark to make troughs and canoes. Those trees, she explained, still looked like trees, whereas the ones stripped by a man who has killed looked like a ghostly shadow, all white among the greenness around them. With hammock and quiver, bow and arrows dangling from the peeled branches. Spirits, evil ones in particular, liked hiding in the vicinity of such places. I had to promise Ratime that if I ever found myself in the neighborhood of such a tree, I would run from the spot as fast as possible. In a voice so low I thought she was talking to herself, Ratime confided her fears to me. She hoped Etue would not collapse under the weight of the man he had killed. The hikuras of a slain man lodge themselves in the killer's chest, where they remain until the dead man's relatives have burned the body and eaten the pulverized bones. The Mokoto-cherry would postpone for as long as possible the burning of the body in the hope that Etue would die from weakness. Will the men talk about the raid? I asked. As soon as they have eaten, Ratime said. With his bow and arrows in hand, Etue walked across the clearing toward the hut where Iramamoe's son had been initiated as a shaman. The men who have been with Etue on the raid covered the sides of the hut with palm fronds. Only a small entrance was left open at the front. They brought him a water-filled calabash and built a fire inside. Etue was to remain in the hut until Puriwariwe would announce that the dead Mokoto-cherry had been burned. Day and night, Etue had to be on the alert in case the dead man's spirit came prowling about the hut in the form of a jaguar. Were Etue to talk, touch a woman, or eat during those days, he would die. Old Hayama, accompanied by her daughter-in-law, came into our hut. I want to find out what's going on at Arasue's place, the old woman said, sitting beside me. Shitomi sat on the ground, reclining her head against my legs, dangling from my hammock. A purple scar, a reminder of the arrow wound, marred the smooth line of her calf. That did not worry Shitomi. She was grateful the wound had not become infected. Matue caught one of the women, Hayama said proudly. It's a good time for him to get another wife. I'd better select the right one for him. I'm sure he will make a mistake if it's left up to him to make the choice. But he has a wife, I stammered, looking at Shitomi. Yes, the old woman agreed. But if he is to have a second wife, this is the best time. Shitomi is young. It will be easy for her to be friends with another woman now. Matue should take the youngest of the three captives. Hayama brushed her hand over Shitomi's shaven tonsure. The girl is younger than you. She will obey you. If you menstruate, she can cook for us. She can help you in the gardens and with the gathering of wood. I'm getting too old to work much. Shitomi examined the three Mokoto-cherry women in Arasue's hut. If Matue is to take another wife, I wish him to take the young girl. I will like her. She can warm his hammock when I'm pregnant. Are you? I asked. I'm not certain, she said, smiling smugly. Hayama had told me some time ago that a pregnant woman usually waited 3 to 4 months, sometimes even longer, before telling her husband of her state. The man was a tacit accomplice in this deception, for he also dreaded the restrictive food and behavior taboos. Whenever a woman suffered a miscarriage or gave birth to a deformed child, she was never at fault. It was the husband who was always blamed. In fact, if a woman repeatedly bore a sickly infant, she was encouraged to conceive by another man. Her own husband, however, had to obey the taboos and raise the baby as his own. Hayama went over to Arasue's hut. I will take this Mokototeri girl with me. She will make a fine wife for my son, she said, taking the girl by the hand. She will live with me in my hut. I captured a woman, Matue said. I don't want this child. She is too thin. I want a strong woman who will bear healthy sons. She will grow strong, Hayama said calmly. She is still green, but soon she will be ripe. Look at her breasts. They are already large. Besides, she added, Shitomi will not mind if you take her. Hayama faced the men gathered inside and outside Arasue's hut. No one is to touch her. I will take care of her until she becomes my son's wife. From today on, she is my daughter-in-law. No objections were raised by the men, as Hayama took the girl into our hut. Shyly, the Mokototeri sat on the ground, close to the hearth. I will not beat you, Shitomi said, taking the girl's hand in hers, but you must do what I tell you. Matue grinned sheepishly at us across the hut. I wondered if he was proud to have 2 wives, or actually embarrassed to be forced into taking a child when he had captured a woman. What will happen to the other captives? I asked. Arasue will take the pregnant one, Hayama declared. How do you know? Without waiting for her answer, I asked about the third one. She will be given to someone as a wife after she has been taken by any of the men in the Shabono who wish to do so, Hayama said. But she has already been raped by the raiders, I said indignantly. Old Hayama burst into laughter. But not by the men who didn't participate in the raid. The old woman patted my head. Don't look so stricken. It's the custom. I was captured once. I was raped by many men. I was lucky and found the chance to escape. No, don't interrupt me, white girl, Hayama said, putting her hand over my mouth. I didn't run away because I had been raped. I forgot that very fast. I escaped because I had to work too hard and was not given enough food. As the old woman had predicted, Arasue took the pregnant woman for himself. You have 3 wives already, the youngest one shouted, her face contorted in anger. Why do you want another one? Giggling nervously, Arasue's 2 other wives watched from their hammocks as the youngest pushed the pregnant woman on the burning coals of the hearth. Arasue jumped out of his hammock, took a burning log from the fire, and handed it to the fallen Mokototeri woman. Burn my wife's arm, he urged the Mokototeri woman as he held his youngest wife pinned against one of the poles in the hut. Sobbing, the pregnant woman covered her burned shoulder with her hand. Burn me, Arasue's wife dared her, twisting away from her husband's grip. If you do, I will burn you alive, but no one will eat your bones. I shall scatter them in the forest so we can piss on them. She stopped. Her eyes widened in genuine astonishment as she discovered the extent of the woman's injured shoulder. You are really burnt. Does it hurt much? Looking up, the Mokototeri wiped the tears from her face. I'm in great pain. Oh, you poor woman. Solicitously, Arasue's wife helped her to stand up, guiding her over to her own hammock. She took leaves from a calabash and gently placed them on the woman's shoulder. It will heal very fast. I will make sure of it. Don't weep any longer, Arasue's oldest wife said, sitting next to the Mokototeri woman. She patted her leg affectionately. Our husband is a good man. He will treat you well. I will make sure no one in the Shabono mistreats you. What will happen when the baby is born? I asked Hayama. That's hard to say, the old woman conceded. She remained quiet for a moment, as if deep in thought. She may kill it. Yet, if it is a boy, Arasue might ask his oldest wife to raise him as if it were his own. Hours later, Arasue began his tale about the events of the raid. We traveled slowly the first day and stopped to rest often. Our backs ached from the heavy loads of plantains. The first night we hardly slept, for we didn't have enough firewood to keep warm. The rain fell. With such force, the night sky seemed to melt with the darkness around us. The following day we walked somewhat faster, arriving in the vicinity of the Mokototeri settlement. We were still far enough away that the enemy hunters would not discover our presence that night, yet close enough that we didn't dare light a fire in our camp. I could only see Arasue's face in profile. Fascinated, I watched the red and black designs on his cheeks moving animately with the rhythm of his speech, as if they had a life of their own. The feathers in his earlobes added a softness to his stern, tired face, a playfulness that belied the horror of his tale. For a few days we carefully watched the comings and goings of our enemy. Our aim was to kill a Mokototeri without alarming their Shabono of our presence. One morning we saw the man who had killed Etue's father walk into the thicket after a woman. Etue shot him in the stomach with one of his poisoned arrows. The man was so dazed he did not even shout. By the time he recovered from his surprise, Etue had shot a second arrow in his stomach and another in his neck, right behind his ear. He fell on the ground dead. Walking like a stunned man, Etue headed home, accompanied by my nephew. Meanwhile, Matue had found the woman hiding in the thicket. He threatened to kill her if she so much as opened her mouth to cough. Matue, together with my youngest son-in-law, headed toward our settlement with the reluctant woman. We were all to meet later at a predetermined location. As the rest of us were deciding whether to split into even smaller groups, we saw a mother with her little son, a pregnant woman, and a young girl, all heading into the forest. We could not resist the temptation. Quietly, we followed them. Leaning back in his hammock, hands locked behind his head, Arasue regarded his spellbound audience. Taking advantage of the headman's pause, one of the men who had been on the raid stood up, motioning the people to make space for him to move. He opened his narration with exactly the same words Arasue used. We traveled slowly the first day. But that was all his and the headman's narratives had in common. Gesticulating a great deal, the man mimicked with exaggerated flair the moods and expressions of different members of the raiding party, thus adding a touch of humor and melodrama to Arasue's dry, matter-of-fact rendition. Encouraged by his audience's laughter and cheers, the man told at great length about the two youngest members of the raiding party. They were no older than 16 or 17. Not only had they complained of sore feet, the cold, and their aches and pains, but they had been afraid of prowling jaguars and spirits on the second night, when they had all slept without lighting a fire. The man interspersed his account with detailed information on the variety of game and ripening wild fruit, color, size, and shape, he had spotted on the way. Arasue resumed his own report as soon as the man paused. When the 3 women and the girl were far enough from the Shabono, the headman continued, we threatened to shoot them if they tried to run away or scream. The small boy managed to sneak into the bushes. We did not pursue him, but retreated as fast as possible, making sure not to leave footprints behind. We were sure that as soon as the Mokoto Terry discovered the dead man, they would follow us. Just before dusk, the mother of the boy who had sneaked away cried out in pain. Sitting on the ground, she pressed her foot between her hands. She wept bitterly, complaining that a poisonous snake had bitten her. Her heartbreaking wails saddened us so much we did not even make sure there had been a snake. What good has it been, she sobbed, for my little son to run away if he no longer has a mother to take care of him? Screaming that she could not bear the pain any longer, the woman hobbled into the bushes. It took us a moment to realize we had been tricked. We searched the forest thoroughly, but we couldn't discover in which direction she had fled. Old Kamasiwe laughed heartily. It's good that she tricked you. It never pays to abduct a woman who has left behind a small child. They cry until they become ill. And worse, they almost always escape. The men talked until the rainy dawn enshrouded the Shabono. In the middle of the clearing stood the solitary hut where Etue was enclosed. It was so quiet and apart, so close, yet so far removed from the voices and laughter. A week later, Puriwariwe visited Etue. As soon as he had eaten a baked plantain and honey, the old man asked Iramamoe to blow a pina into his head. Chanting, Puriwariwe danced around Etue's hut. The dead man has not yet burned, he announced. His body has been placed in a trough. It is rotting high up in a tree. Do not break your silence yet. The hakuras of the dead man are still in your chest. Prepare your new arrows and bow. Soon the Mokoto Terry will burn the rotting flesh, for the worms are already crawling out of the carcass. The old Shapori circled Etue's hut once more, then danced across the clearing into the forest. 3 days later, Puriwariwe announced that the Mokoto Terry had burned the dead man. Take out the sticks from your earlobes untie the ones from your wrists, he said, helping Etue stand up. In a few days, take your old bow and arrows to the same peeled tree on which you hung your hammock and quiver. Puriwariwe led Etue into the forest. Arasue, together with some of the men who had been on the raid, followed behind. They returned in the late afternoon. Etue's hair had been cut, his tonsure shaven. His body had been washed and painted afresh with anoto. Cane rods, decorated with red macaw feathers, had been inserted in his earlobes. He also wore the new fur armbands, adorned with feathers, and the thick cotton waist belt Ritime had made for him. Arasue offered Etue a basket full of tiny fish he had cooked for him in pisansi leaves. 3 days later, Etue ventured for the first time by himself into the forest. I've shot a monkey, he announced hours later, standing in the clearing. As soon as a group of men had gathered around him, he gave them precise information as to where the animal could be found. To ensure the aid and protection of the hakuras during future hunts, Etue went 2 more times by himself into the forest. On each occasion he returned without the kill, then informed others where they could locate it. Etue did not eat of the monkey and the 2 pikaris he had shot. One afternoon he returned with a curassow hung from his back. He scalped the bird, saving the strip of skin where the curly black feathers were attached. It would serve as an armband. The wing feathers he saved for feathering his arrows. He cooked the almost 2-foot-long bird on a wooden platform he had built over the fire. Tasting to see if the curassow was done thoroughly, he then proceeded to divide it between his children and 2 wives. "Is the white girl your child or your wife?" Old Hayama shouted from her hut, as Etue handed me a piece of the dark breast meat. "She is my mother," Etue said, joining the laughing Itikoteri. Days later, Arasue supervised the cooking of plantain pap. Etue emptied a small gourd into the soup. Ritime told me they were the last of the powdered bones of Etue's father. Tears rolled down the men's and women's cheeks as they swallowed the thick soup. I took the calabash ladle Etue offered me and cried for his dead father. As soon as the trough was empty, Arasue shouted at the top of his voice, "What a Waiteri man we have amongst us. He has killed his enemy. He has carried the dead man's hikuras in his chest without succumbing to hunger or loneliness during his confinement." Etue walked around the clearing. "Yes, I am Waiteri," he sang. "The hikuras of a dead man kill the strongest warrior. It's a heavy burden to carry them. For so many days, a person can die of sorrow." Etue began to dance. "I no longer think about the man I killed. I dance with the shadows of the night, not with the shadows of death." The longer he danced, the lighter and faster his steps became, as though through the movements he was finally able to shake off the burden he had borne in his chest. Many an evening, the events of the raid were retold by the men. Even old Kamosiwe had a version. All the stories had in common with the original one was that Etue had killed a man, that 3 women had been captured. In time, only a vague memory of the actual facts remained, and it became a tale of the distant past, like all the other stories the Itikoteri were so fond of telling.